everybody! So, we all know that one of the most studied and considered periods, not only in English literature but in European culture, is the Romantic period, Romanticism. So my idea today is to give you a sort of an introduction, short maybe, but complete introduction, in order to be able to understand social and historical context, but also to somehow to remember some key concepts, some ideas that will help us then to study some of the poets or the greatest writers and intellectuals of the time. So first of all, we have to remember that Romanticism was the so-called age of revolutions. Which revolutions are we talking about? First of all, the American Declaration of Independence was signed, and that was something completely new. The American Revolution changed completely the attitude and the idea of England, of Britain, concerning colonialism, concerning the empire. That was a great loss, and then after some time during Victorian age we have a new idea of empire developed by Queen Victoria that was absolutely important to develop economy, English economy. And we can talk about the Commonwealth and another kind of empire. So this is a complete change, okay, concerning the idea of colonialism and concerning the idea of empire. Then a second revolution we can remember, extremely important. It's not just a political revolution, but also an ideological revolution, is the French Revolution, obviously. Which created both enthusiasm on one side and on the other side also radicalism sometimes, especially in England. And then after the French Revolution we know that Napoleon started his own empire, and that somehow also involved England. And we have to remember that in 1815, when Napoleon was defeated in Waterloo, it was the Duke of Wellington who actually led the battle. So we can say that Britain is extremely involved in the political changes of the time. But when we talk about age of revolution, we don't talk just about revolution, political revolutions, we can say so, but also some other kinds of changes. The Industrial Revolution. First of all, Industrial Revolution that developed specifically during the end of the 18th century, and so then during the 19th century, changed completely the social structure, the economical structure of Britain, and then of Europe, of course. It could also cause a very large quantity of social unrest. Okay, especially because of the reaction of the working class, okay, against the owners, against the middle class most of the times. It also provoked some other changes in some other fields, like, for example, we can talk about agricultural revolution, we can talk about transport revolution. This is also very important, not just as far as economy is concerned, as far as trade is concerned. But we know that transports mean that not only goods can travel across Britain or across Europe, but also people travel, and so ideas travel in less time and for a longer path. So generally, we can consider that intellectuals during the Romantic period, and we have to remember that when we talk about Romanticism, we are talking about a movement, not a currents, because this movement is formed by many different currencies throughout Europe, because it involves all Europe in different moments and focusing different aspects. And we'll see this. So this period caused a sort of an enthusiasm, okay, especially in the poets at the time. We're talking about Blake or Wordsworth or Coleridge. They had this feeling that they could be present in such an sort of an apocalyptic moment, okay, in Europe, and so that provoked a sort of a new energy and enthusiasm in their works. Obviously, as I said before, Romanticism developed in different ways, in different countries. Like, for example, in Germany, first of all, we have to remember that Romanticism in Germany started from the Sturm und Drang, okay, that developed more or less in 1770, more or less. And so it developed from there, and it was especially focused on the philosophical aspect. Then in England, of course, we'll see it obviously later, it's pretty much about poetry and the ideal of poetry and the ideal of the poet-prophet, for example. In France, the French Romanticism was focused on drama, on literary criticism, and obviously there was also a strong political element because of the period, important period of revolutions France was living. We can also remember that Jean-Jacques Rousseau, influenced the thought of many romantic intellectuals throughout all Europe. And we can remember that the idea of Rousseau, the philosophy of Rousseau, concerned the human being that was considered to be good, okay, to be essentially good in nature, and then he was potentially corrupted by society, by the structure of society, and especially by private property. Okay, so this was a very interesting philosophy that could really influence many intellectuals and especially poets. Italy came a little later, but in Italy, Romanticism was also and especially based on the idea or the development of the novel and of poetry as well. So this period, as I said before, was especially based on a sort of a new economy which was based on the middle class. Okay, this rising class was extremely strong at the moment, and the middle class, the upper middle class, was now ruling the economical and the social world. There is especially one work that influenced the thought, the economical thought, but also the perspective towards government, so towards the idea of state, which was written by Adam Smith. Okay, was written by Adam Smith in 1776, and it was called The Wealth of Nations. It was based on a principle, on a concept that was called laissez-faire, which is French, and it means it sometimes expresses the idea that there should be no interference, okay, no action of the government in economical policies and in economical actions in general. This is a very modern point of view, and we can say that from this moment on we can start to consider, okay, the roots of the future capitalism, liberalism, which is something different too. So back to our literature, back to arts in general. I told you we would have fixed some key concepts, some key points, okay, that represent art and literature in general. Talking specifically about England, but as I told you before, this is influencing also culture throughout all Europe. We can say that the first important point, the first important theme is the stress on imagination. Imagination is an absolute key word when we talk about Romanticism. Imagination, so subjectivity somehow. So a personal point of view, a personal perspective. Especially the poet was considered the one who could really use imagination through his own inward eye. Inward eye is a word that William Wordsworth uses in his work, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, or The Daffodils if you prefer. And he really talked about this eye, that was the eye of imagination, through which the poet, himself in this case, were able to understand, to see deeper into things, to understand, to watch, okay? And imagination was a sort of a lens. Through this lens they could understand more, they could see more than other people. So imagination is absolutely important, and probably this was also the point that inspired the definition of the poet as poet-prophet, because actually the poet was able to look deeper into things and to convey, okay, and to express what they could understand through art. Okay, in order to help other people to understand what they could really see using their inward eye, which was something special they had. That was why they were called poet-prophets. So, second key point, second key concept. First one was stress on imagination, the second one is about the artist. The artist is now free. Is completely free from, we can say, any kind of rule. We're not just talking about social rules or social aspects, we're also talking about artistic aspects. He's free from neoclassicism, for example. Absolutely free. Which reminds us of the concept of the génie in the Sturm und Drang in Germany. The génie was the genius, we can say, in the translation, but génie is a concept that somehow expressed this independence of the intellectual, okay, who was absolutely self-aware, self-conscious and independent. This is also very important. So third concept, third point says, first one was the stress on imagination, second is the artist, okay, who is completely free, so freedom, independence of the artist. Second key concept is nature. Nature is the most important topic when considering Romanticism. Nature is the inspiration, okay, of all artists, of all poets, and not only. Nature was the place where artists could find their inspiration, and it was also the place where we can say hidden truths could be found. So nature is considered as an organic living whole, which means that in nature we found spirituality. And the concept of nature is a very pantheistic concept, okay? So now we are developing a new idea also of spirituality. Everything inside nature is alive, and nature is this organic whole, organic living whole, okay? Completely new concept, and absolutely very, very, very present in poetry especially. The last one, so the fourth and last key concept, I remember again, first one was stress on imagination, then independence of the artist, and nature as an organic living whole. And the fourth point is imagery. So imagery also connected to the idea of myth, for example, of mythology, of symbolism. This is also interesting because this imagery was also, we can say, was also connected with the idea of the artist that could see, could look deeper into things, okay, using his imagination, as we said before. And he could be able to understand, to find out that sort of a transcendental, that sort of a super sensible truth, okay, that metaphysical truth that other people couldn't actually understand, couldn't actually touch somehow. Björk considered the idea of how beauty, how the concept of beauty was treated at the time, was considered at the time. And he divided the concept of beauty into two parts. One concerning what is beautiful and the other side sublime. So beautiful is that beauty, okay, that are beautiful concern all those elements that were somehow controlled, regular, tamed, we can say, that were somehow reassuring for the human being. They were so delicate, balanced somehow. On the other side, we have the sublime. The sublime is something completely different. It also belongs to the idea of beauty, but it is huge, it's dangerous, it could be even fatal somehow, okay? And still it is absolutely fascinating and it attracts the human being, okay? So starting from the concept of sublime, we can see the development of another concept, which is picturesque. And picturesque influences all the Gothic elements and all the Gothic currences we have in this period, which are very, very popular and widespread. We talked in my previous video about Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley. So, there are obviously some authors that are inspired by the concept of beautiful and others from the concept of sublime. When talking about beautiful, we can mention Wordsworth, for example. When we talk about the sublime, we can mention Coleridge. They wrote together the lyrical ballads, but they talked and wrote from two opposite perspectives. And Blake as well, in his own works, in the Songs of Innocence, particularly in The Lamb, he represented the beautiful side of art. In his other work, his other collection, Songs of Experience, in particular The Tiger, he talked about the ideal of sublime. All of them, Wordsworth, Coleridge and Blake, were all belonging to the first generation of Romantic poets. Then we have the second generation. We have Lord Byron, we have Percy B. Shelley, we have John Keats, for example, and they developed their own idea of not only beautiful or sublime, but also other aspects, like, for example, desperate and tragic love, like, for example, a different role in Lord Byron of the individual, okay, and his own steady independence, or in Percy B. Shelley's case, another idea of art which should resume somehow in a huge net all elements of mythology and history of art, and some also folkloristics element and so on. So completely different ideas and perspectives, because as I told you, Romanticism is a great movement, and inside this movement we have a lot of different currencies, a lot of different points of view. When talking about poetry, it's important to remember that poets at the time used particularly ballads and lyrics in general. Okay, we have mentioned before, for example, the lyrical ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge. Okay, when talking about Coleridge, we can mention the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, one of the most famous ballads in the Romantic period. They were all based, as I said before, on a sort of a personal experience of the world, of spirituality, personal perception, okay, of the world, of nature, especially, as we said before. Nature that was somehow opposed, okay, to Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution was now seen as an enemy that was corrupting nature. And some poems express that in a very strong way. Let's think, for example, let's think of London by William Blake. He talked about the city that was corrupted, that was sold as a prostitute, that was becoming dark because of pollution. Blake again wrote The Chimney Sweeper. In this case, we have the child, which is we can say the symbol of purity, that is exploited, that is corrupted by this new system. Childhood, actually, children were also a very important theme, a very recurring and cyclic theme in Romanticism. They are always the symbol of innocence and purity. Talking about Blake, we can remember that the lamb in the Songs of Experience was the symbol of innocence, was the symbol of childhood, and in this case we have also a Christian symbolism, and probably we can say that Blake was one of the last Romantic poets who actually talked or used a Christian symbolism, but the lamb is also a very strong symbol for Christ. Okay. So, then talking about imagination, I've mentioned before that I wandered lonely as a cloud. This is absolutely iconic. It's iconic because the idea of the poet that can experience something very simple, like watching daffodils, like watching these small flowers, and then when he gets back home, he remembers these flowers using his inward eye, we have mentioned before. He gets back to them. So memory is another important, very strong element and concept of Romanticism. Now, we have talked about poetry because poetry is, as I said, one of the symbols, one of the most important elements of Romanticism. But we don't have to remember to forget that also fiction, okay, was somehow important and representative. Fiction that was specifically meant for entertainment at the time. So in this case, we have that concept. We have talked about that in my video about the rise of the novel, of the modern novel. We have this sort of a division or a discussion about good literature and bad literature. So bad literature concerned especially all those works that were just meant for the market, okay, that were just meant to sell, basically. And normally they had some mechanical cliches and some very mechanical plots with a forced happy ending, okay, and this pattern was only meant to please the public somehow. In fact, during the 18th and the 19th century, we started to talk about professional writers, okay, and they had to consider writing as a true work, and they had to give their literary product, okay, to publishing houses. This is why often we talk about this good literature and this bad literature that was especially based on a sort of an economical need, we can say so. But anyway, we have great novelists, we have absolutely great novelists in this period, in the Romantic period, and we can say that women started to play an important role in literature. We can mention, for example, Anne Radcliffe, who was so representative for the Gothic currents, okay, with her novels full of fearful events and gloomy and creepy aspects and settings, for example. Jane Austen, something completely different from Anne Radcliffe, absolutely opposite to that. She wrote her novel of manners, in which she talked about her social class, which was the gentry, and appearances and manners, and we can say conventions, okay, that belong to her so-called small world. She represented this world with a sort of an affection because she belonged to it, but at the same time she also criticized it in a very subtle way, okay, with a small irony, and she criticized the exaggerations, okay, she criticized the exaggerations of appearances, the lack of self-consciousness sometimes, the lack of we can say the lack of generosity. And also during this time, also during the Romantic period, we have talked about her during my last video. We can mention Mary Shelley, of course. She was also so important as far as the Gothic novel is concerned. She wrote Frankenstein, and we can remember all the important elements she introduced for the first time in literature, because it was a Gothic novel, this is true, it was Gothic fiction, but it was for the very first time in history also science fiction. Okay, so this is sort of a big picture, okay, in which we can somehow find our intellectuals, our poets, our writers. Then we'll talk about all of them in detail, but if we remember these aspects, we are absolutely able to give an interpretation, a larger interpretation to their works. I hope this is useful for you, and I'll see you later, okay, with my next video about Romantic poets. Thank you very much, and see you very, very soon.